Hi, Jamie Cowen here to continue the series of a different way of looking at politics. Today, I'm tackling the environment, a no-brainer for believers. I've never understood why so many followers of Yeshua have dismissed environmentalism as some radical left-wing agenda item. The Bible is pretty clear about humanity's role as caretakers of the earth. I believe the common evangelical view, which often castigates environmental concerns, is once again more a product of merging conservative politics with faith rather than letting faith inform how we view individual policy issues. Ironically, the Environmental Protection Agency, the agency responsible for environmental issues in the United States, was established under Republican President Richard Nixon in 1970. Those in Western countries take clean air and water for granted these days, but that was not always the case. A terrible smog caused by factory pollution and a temperature inversion resulted in multiple fatalities in a small town in Pennsylvania in 1948 and in London, England in 1952, leading to legislation curbing air pollution in both countries. I remember in 1970, in my senior year of high school, the same year Earth Day was inaugurated, that a bunch of students went down to the Potomac River outside of Washington, D.C. to hang out. At that time, swimming was prohibited in the Potomac due to water pollution. 2 years later, the Clean Water Act was passed in response to a fire breaking out on the Cuyahoga River outside of Cleveland, Ohio, due to industrial pollution. Since then, the Potomac River and many other bodies of water are now swimmable and fishable. Over time, however, as more environmental laws were passed and the Environmental Protection Agency grew bigger and more assertive, numerous industries and interest groups pushed back against the cumulative restrictions. However, that shouldn't change our view towards protecting our world. It's a question of balance. Most importantly, what does the Bible say, if anything, about protecting the environment? A recently published book on a biblically based view of the environment was written by an old and very good friend of ours, Dr. Sandra Richter, the Robert Gundy Chair of Biblical Studies at Westmont College in California. The book is called Stewards of Eden: What Scripture Says About the Environment and Why It Matters. The book provides an excellent overview of the biblical mandate to protect the environment and offers numerous case studies of where communities around the world violated basic biblical principles and the concomitant cost to their societies. I highly recommend the book. The book's title lays a foundation about how we should view the world through the lens of the Garden of Eden. As we know from Genesis, God created the heavens and the earth and determined that everything was good. First came the atmosphere, then land, then the sea, then plants, then fish and animals, and then humankind. In the garden, everything was plentiful. Everything was in harmony. God and man and man, and man and nature. Adam and Eve were charged with going forth to rule the earth under God's dominion, bringing God's order and provision throughout the earth. Of course, we know the fall disrupted but not destroyed this plan. The fall caused a breach between God and man, and even man and nature. As God said to Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life." But that's not the end of the story. When God led the Israelites out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, He dictated a legal code to His people that would reflect His character. And He told them that they would be a kingdom of priests in order to ultimately bring the world back under God's dominion as depicted in the Garden of Eden. One of the first things that God instructed the Israelites to do while on Mount Sinai was to build a tabernacle for God's presence. The tabernacle was constructed as a type of throne room, mirroring God's throne in heaven. Many of the tabernacles were depictions of the Garden of Eden. When God eventually inhabited the tabernacle, it was the first time since the Garden of Eden that God abode on the earth. The idea was for the Israelites to establish a kingdom in the land of Israel where God's presence reigned and where the nations learned of the ways of the Lord. It was a type of fulfillment of the original charge to Adam and Eve. God dictated numerous laws involving protecting and preserving the land and animal life. Every 7 years, the land was to rest and not be planted and plowed. God made it clear that the land was his, and the Israelites were merely tenants. Interestingly, to this day, most of the land in the modern nation of Israel is not owned privately, but rather people use it or build on it and have only long-term leases. This is to reflect the biblical idea that God owns the land. We know from the scriptures that the first Commonwealth of Israel failed in her mission to be God's society. But the prophets promised that that was not the end of the story. The prophet Isaiah described the coming judgment on Israel. Yet following that, one would come from within to restore the nation and help her fulfill her mission to the world. That person is the Messiah. According to Isaiah, the result would be, quote, "The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea." Unquote. Note, this vision is an allusion to a restored Garden of Eden, but this time covering all the earth. There will be no harm or destruction. That is God's vision for our world. The Apostle Paul reiterates this in the book of Romans, where he says, "The creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God." Guess what, folks? The creation, the earth and its environment, is waiting for us. We are the children of God. As part of the gospel, which reconciles God and man through the Messiah and calls us to love one another, we are also to reconcile ourselves with nature around us, to preserve and restore what God created. That doesn't mean to stop all industrial production. The industries fueled by natural resources such as coal, oil, and gas have brought untold blessings to the world in terms of health, longevity of life, prosperity, and well-being. However, those industries and others have led to a polluted world. We are called to address it both individually and collectively. For many years, my wife has been an avid recycler, long before it became popular. As soon as our particular trash service provided recycling in our area, we switched to that provider. Later, the county took it over. We instituted recycling in our congregation, especially since we all ate together after services, leading to tons of empty plastic bottles. When we moved to Israel, my wife was distressed about the plastic bags used in every store and then thrown away, creating massive amounts of plastic waste and landfills and floating in our oceans. So she created her own business, converting discarded plastic bags into beautiful tote bags that can be used for years. You can see her Facebook page below. These are just a few examples of how we, as followers of Yeshua, can help our world and lead to a vision of a restored Garden of Eden. Yet the biggest impact on the environment can be made through public policy, which collectively can protect our world. Whereas the environmental challenge of 50 years ago was air and water pollution, today it's climate change. The consequences of air and water pollution are much more visible to the naked eye. Climate change is gradual and somewhat more theoretical, but it's real. Just as smoking over time inexorably leads to lung cancer, smoke belching from industrial smokestacks in cars and trucks inexorably alters our atmosphere. As the singer-songwriter Barry McGuire wrote over 50 years ago, we're on the eve of destruction. Rather than subsidizing coal, gas, and oil production, which the government does through tax policy, how about the same money being redirected towards renewable resources like the sun, wind, geothermal energy, and hydrogen? A huge source of air pollution and concomitant global warming comes from car and truck exhausts. The most effective policy to transform the type of transportation we use is a gas or carbon tax. The last time the federal gas tax was raised in the United States was 18 years ago. It's currently 18 cents a gallon. The average price of gasoline in the United States is $2.88 a gallon. The average price in Israel, get ready, $7.30 a gallon, 2.5 times as much. The average price in Europe is $6.05 a gallon. The difference in prices is gas taxes. Now, of course, no one likes taxes, but they are a fact of life and they are a matter of public policy. Subsidies and tax credits are provided for those things we support. Taxes are imposed to fund the government and to change societal behavior. Honestly, it's time for a change. I want to make it clear. I'm not necessarily advocating for one policy over another. I'm just saying, as followers of Yeshua, we have a responsibility to our world, both in terms of personal salvation and communal well-being, to do what we can to lead us to a restored Eden. Support for reasonable environmental policies and practices should be a no-brainer for believers. Back during the Jesus movement of the 1970s, one of that era's early Christian musicians, Larry Norman, wrote the song, "Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music?" I would say today, why should the secular people have all the good policies? Let's ensure that the gospel genuinely affects public policy for the good of the whole. Isn't that what Yeshua is all about? Thank you, and see you next time.